This is Kathy from Erwin, and I'm pleased to introduce our session today on managing compliance with Erwin DM. And I'm joined today with David Wiebe from Robinson Ryan. David, thank you so much for joining us at Erwin Insights.
Hi, Kathy. Yeah, good to be here.
We really appreciate it. Without further ado, why don't you take it away and begin today's session?
Okay, so managing compliance with Erwin DM. You might think it's a dry subject, but I don't think so. I've been using Erwin Data Modeler since it first came out, version 1, back in 1994. And it's a very powerful tool for me now as a data architect. I used to use it as a data developer, but now more so as I've gotten older doing data architecture work. Anyway, so it's not that dry of a subject, regulation. We'll see. Let's get started. So regulation, what is it? It's one of these levers in government, and compliance offers an outcome that benefits regulated entities. The regulator monitors the environment, watching for hotspots, and they're responsible for coming up with a plan to address the different situations. They're out there bringing ways to improve the viscosity in transitioning activities involved in conducting business, right? How easy it is to do activities while you're doing business. And also the safety of the individual and or organization and the marketplace itself while you're conducting business. Regulation creates an alignment between the burden of compliance with best practices for surviving in business. And in these days, a lot of those cases involve doing business in the digital world. So how are we going to survive in this digital world? APRA is an independent statutory authority established for the purpose of prudential supervision of financial institutions for promoting financial system stability in Australia. They are the prudential supervisor and resolution authority for the majority of the Australian financial services sector. It's their mandate to protect the Australian community by establishing and enforcing prudential standards and practices that are designed to ensure that promises are met. And APRA balances objectives to promote financial system stability in Australia. Cyber attacks are increasing in frequency, sophistication, and impact, with the perpetrators continually refining their efforts to compromise systems, networks, and information worldwide. The financial sector is one of the more prominent targets for these such attacks. A key driver of this trend is the increasing usage of technology in the financial sector to improve customer service and operational efficiency. Consequently, stakeholders, including the board of directors, senior management, shareholders, customers, and regulators, have heightened expectations for the effective safeguarding of information assets underpinned by an organizational culture that promotes information security. The guide provides guidance to organizations, their regulated entities. This prudential standard aims to ensure that the regulated entity takes measures to be resilient against information security incidents, including cyber attacks, by maintaining an information security capability commensurate with the information security vulnerabilities and threats they're subject to. This guide targets areas where weaknesses in information security management continues to be identified as part of APRA's ongoing supervision activities. It provides guidance to the implementation of Prudential Standard CPS 234 on information security. It is the intended outcome is to ensure that these regulated entities take measures to be resilient against information security incidents so that financial promises made by these regulated entities to their beneficiaries are met. Sounds simple enough? And a couple of years ago, there was the announcement. And it was like hot off the newsroom floor and into the email box. with links to the regulator's website. Something's coming. Nothing worse than seeing another reporting obligation. And in this case, when the news of the reporting obligation came in on CPS 234 on information security, it ultimately arrives with the CEO. Now, how will the board understand what this means? That's what he's wondering. And because they have to make the best decisions going forwards. So, how to deal with this? Let's see what they have to say. When the reporting obligation is given to the CEO, who do they turn to understand what it all means and how to comply? Is it the chief marketing officer? Well, I understand that if we stuff it up, the brand is going to take a beating. Now, I need to take this call. Big campaign and all. Just if you pull it off, I want to hear about it. It'll make our organization look very competent. Anyway, isn't it about information? Is it the chief financial officer? Well, I understand there'll be funding required to add to this compliance capability into the enterprise. Now, don't spend too much money. Still, it's probably going to be less than one of their fines or penalties. Hang on a minute, my priority phone is ringing. Excuse me, please. Anyway, isn't this about security? So is it the chief operating officer? I understand that more capability means more activities that need operating, and people doing things for the first time is always fun to watch. I'm hoping that we're going to get some automation. I'm hoping we're going to see a plan of what's involved before we start building stuff. Sheesh, my phone is vibrating about something. Just a minute. Anyway, isn't this about compliance? So is it the chief risk officer? Well, I understand that complying with regulation is a good thing. Granted, we have carriage to ensure compliance is met, as failure to comply means we have holes in our information security practice. And if the threats and vulnerabilities don't get us, the incidents will. Worthy of tracking on the risk register. Now, let me check something. I'll be right back. Anyway, isn't this about information technology systems? Is it the chief information officer? I understand that the regulation will be checking on the inventory of technology systems and the security over the inventory of the applications and technology across the organization. Yes, our systems need to be accounted for, assessed, and classified. After all, they handle all the data, I mean information. Uh, Apologies, I just need to check on the status of one of our clouds. Anyway, isn't this about how we are managing the data? So is it the chief data officer? Yes, I understand how data is managed and how to interpret, plan, and govern the activities to fully understand the data requirement. Our team of data management professionals specialize in facilitating the delivery of quality data by placing governance activities throughout the data and information lifecycle. People skilled with the abilities to understand the data required to fulfill these reporting obligations, ensuring the right data is being collected and assembled in a manner that the regulator expects. Sounds like the CEO knows where to start and gives the chief data officer the task of understanding what the regulation is all about and to report back. The chief data officer understands what it takes to manage data and recognizes the different capabilities needed depending on what needs to be done and what needs doing. So capabilities, they're grouped in based on the life cycle of the data and information, planning, risk, operations, and product. Now, delivering data solutions starts with a planning and a plan. And in the data management profession, planning involves understanding the metadata, just how much is understood about the data is required, architecture, how much of the data required is understood, and what is available right now. And then data modeling and design to explain the data requirement in a manner that the business understands and can make decisions on how to collect and report it to the regulator. It's true that risk is a key consideration in the regulatory solutions, as but it's considered a fundamental in all data management solutions initiatives. So processes will come into play to assign to governance controls necessary to complete the task. Also, data quality standards will be set at their highest levels. Security will be enforced over access to the data to ensure that it's maintain its integrity. And document and content management systems will be used to maintain the records of compliant practices, assessments, and reported results. So with that in mind, planning capabilities are called upon, and using Erwin Data Modeler to plan your data needs is a good place to start. It lets you document the business requirements in a conceptual data model. It's a drawing, a picture of the data of the business understands. Now, the regulation talks about an information asset. So what's that? We have to give it a definition and use the one that the regulation talks about. What we're doing here is starting to build a model of the regulation. Now, Erwin has these themes. It's a means to assign a format to an object that of that theme. Now, I use themes to identify subject areas, not data model subject areas, but these highest level of data grouping that a data architect uses. And in this case, I've decided that the information asset concept is an entity in a register. So I'm using a subject area called a register entry. And in typical fashion, Erwin provides me extensive options. And in this case, it allows the user to configure anything that's assigned to a local theme. It's also very handy for quick understanding of what's in scope of the data asset. So for me, I'm primarily using this fill option here to make sure that I can easily see when I'm talking about the information asset. The regulation also talks about this concept called information security. And I put it in a subject area called risk. The regulation says that information security is a risk that needs to be managed. But what does that mean? Well, one other thing about Erwin, it gives you these dialog boxes to collect metadata about the different objects. And assigning metadata to an entity is done through this entity dialog box. You can see it has 9 tabs. This one, definition, is definition. And because the model you are seeing right now is a definition view, you're seeing the definition. Other tabs like volumetrics is for recording how many instances of the concept you're expecting and is the number growing and by how much. Style is where we assign the theme register entry to the information asset entity. Icon is used for assigning graphics to the concept if you want. And there's 5 different ways to view these concepts. Icon is just one of them. Anyway, now back to information security is a risk that needs to be managed. But what does that mean? The regulation says specifically information security threats and vulnerabilities. And what does that mean? Weaknesses that could be, and you can see in the definitions on the slide. The regulation says to use policy in the form of a framework. And why? Oh, one more thing about the entity dialog box. The tab where used. It's available on all the objects in the model. It tells you where this actual object is being used, either in a subject area or attached to a relationship or the name of the diagram it's in. This is a very handy feature, especially when the model gets quite large. The regulation calls out exactly what it means by control and capability, so there's no misunderstanding. Control, a prevention, detection, or response measure to reduce the likelihood or impact of an information security incident. And then the information security capability, it's all this the totality of resources, skills, and controls, which provide the ability and capability to maintain information security. So now we're getting really good, clear understanding about what's going on. Oh, and the regulation also wants to know about any information security incidents, actual ones or potential compromises. So the purpose of that high-level model is to quickly understand where people's minds need to go, get the context, read the definitions, get understanding. Definitions described by the regulation, and they're endorsed by the business, confirming that people understand what it is that the data solution needs to address. So what else? So now that we sort of have an understanding what the scope's all about, let's find about a little more detail. So remember how we started with those information assets? Well, the information asset may be managed by the regulated entity, the enterprise. Oh, another thing about those entity tabs, UDPs, user-defined properties. It's like your own grab bag of additional metadata you might want to collect about the data model object. There's another dialog box that helps you define what these UDPs are on your data model object of choice. So choosing the right kind of data you want to collect based on the object. And in this case, you can see that I've set up some things around additional metadata around the security. Okay, back to our information asset. But that information asset might also be managed by another party. Oh, and also another thing on that entity, it maintains a history of all the things that happen to the object as it goes through. Now, in my case, it's pretty boring since I'm the only one working on it, and you can see this is when the object was created. And if that information asset is being managed by the enterprise, we want to recognize that that enterprise is made up of organizational units. Oh, and just quickly going back here, controlling what is displayed in this diagram is done through a dialog box. It comes with a dozen tabs, and here you can see that I've chosen the entity view, and that's why we're only seeing the entities. And these are the other options that you can see under here. So when you want to see attributes, you click on the attribute. Okay, back to our model. Talking about those organizational units, what are we talking about here? The board, senior management, and its governing bodies, they are all part of the enterprise. And so that's the way we're demonstrating it. And also part of the enterprise recognizes that there are people within the organizational units, and they are the ones that are ultimately responsible for this. As for those other parties managing the enterprise's information assets, both related parties and third parties are identified as relevant in the regulation. And of course, there's the regulator, the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, and they're the ones who is the authority of the Prudential Standard. And in this case, CPS 234. And CPS 234 defines the terms within the responsibility that is the obligation of the enterprise. And here I've included some types of entities that are included in that box. Quite a few enterprises out there are made of multiple types of business. You will also notice that the relationships here all have the same verb phrases. Verb phrases, all have verb phrases. Verb phrases are used to articulate business rules that can be described and implemented in a data solution. The information security obligation is the obligation that the enterprise is the obligation of the enterprise, and you can't have one without an enterprise being responsible for it. So this is where you maintain it all in the relationship editor. And you can see over here the parent to child phrase and the child to parent phrase. I use these quite a bit because if you're going to do data modeling and you're going to draw relationships, you need to write down these verb phrases so people understand the context in which you're designing the data solution or understanding the data requirement. Okay. Now, anyway, just quickly on that, other things that were important here was around the nullability, letting you know whether things have to be mandatory, whether there needs to be a relationship between these entities. Okay, let's go back to the model here. So specifically, these information security obligations that CPS 234 has said on the enterprise, they consist of a number of what I've called information security obligation items. And one of the types of them is a compliance item. And you can see that what we're expecting is that there's an information asset. That was one of the compliance option requirements, that you did maintain an information asset. It also talked about a responsibility to be directed by an information security policy framework. And what the regulation says, that framework is made up of policies, standards, guidelines, and the reports that have to come out. Now you will see that I've put some examples of the type of policies that the regulation are suggesting the enterprise should be considering. And I've added through an erwin what they call an annotation object, where you set up your text and then place it on the model. Now I've got lots here, you can see, and they're so very, very useful. Okay, back to this exciting regulation here. Now, what the regulation talks about tracking the information security capability activities that occur due to the fact that the information security procedures that are outlined in the framework. And here you thought what we're trying to say here, the information security procedure makes use of all these capability activities. So, but which activities? Oh, and quickly, another feature of erwin DM I wanted to show you that you can do with the data model when you're ready is that you can actually add other models into this models to help help use stuff that you've modeled already, but you can also derive new models, which is really important. So when you're taking your data solution further out of the conceptual view, you're going to push it into a logical view before you actually build something. So this is where the functionality of erwin DM helps you actually build the final solutions. And then once you've built them, there's another option here. You can see just above here, complete compare. And this is always comparing your models against each other, or even comparing your model against the actual database that's behind the scenes. All right, back to the regulation here. Now that I have this information security capability, it's going to demonstrate back to the regulation that I actually do have an information security capability. And is maintained by the enterprise, and that information security capability is out there to protect. And the information asset information security capability is the one that's out there protecting these information assets. What are the things we're doing to protect our assets? Now, the information security capability must be maintained with respect to vulnerability and threats. We need to seize the data about these things. So, but both of which are monitored through information security controls, and we need to see data about these things too. What are we actually doing? We're controlling access, and we're also controlling the life cycle of the information asset, the IT asset. The standard then goes on to identify that you need to establish a set of classifications. As you can see, here's 5 down the side: sensitivity, criticality, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And you need data lists. So how are you going to, what values are you going to use? So each one of those classifications is going to get its own set of states. And how you actually can do that in Erwin is by setting up a at the attribute level, what are the actual valid values that you will use for each one of those classifications. That way you're centralizing everything and keeping it a consistent view across the implementation. So now that we have this in place, an unfortunate incident occurs where something happens to an information asset. We have to record this in the register. We have to recognize what kind of incident was it. We have to classify that incident with some relevant type of interest to the organization, whether it's financial or non-financial. And remember, each information asset involves data from an enterprise data subject area. So it's important to know which ones are involved. So your first step in understanding what your information asset is by understanding what's inside it. So this diagram I included as well records the different types of APRA-regulated entities that are responsible, and their legislation that appears so that that's particular to that type of entity. And it also shows the section and the act that the prudential standard makes reference to. This was an important view we put together because it reinforces 2 things. Foreign entities or conglomerates, which are a group of organizations that have Australian branches, are obliged under this regulation. And as head of the group or conglomerate, they are obliged to manage this regulator's information security standard. And one final point, the prudential standard here makes that they've given us is, they say, is likely to change over time. So be ready to keep track of how the standard does change and what you're doing with it. So in less than 4 weeks, the Chief Data Officer returns to the board to share in the understanding of the main concepts, like the data asset, involved in meeting their obligations for compliance and successfully reporting it in a manner that is required by the authority, and points out quickly that here is the board and everyone in the room, our responsibility to exercise quality information security practices. The board understands the concepts and scope involved and feels confident about making the right decision, and endorses an initiative to operationalize the management of the data involved with meeting their obligations. Planning efforts surrounding the understanding and scope of data involved is well advanced now and set in a data pattern we know how to work with. Governing the enterprise, data understanding comes out of the data office and coordinates a shared understanding of the things we are communicating about. Metadata, data architecture, data modeling and design are all practiced when planning and leveraged when it comes time to build and implement. And don't forget, that's where you are the board in the model, so you are included in the concept. That was a quick look at how to start planning for a regulation coming your way. It starts off by understanding what it means, knowing its scope, and what the regulator wants is a massive advantage before you actually start to build your data solution. Like all data solutions, it starts with planning. If the first task in your implementation project is to determine data requirements, it's most likely going to fail. Remember, Erwin, it's about planning. Erwin Data Modeler is a planning tool that helps you start on the right track to get your solution built. Now, having said all that, that's all I got really to say now. Thanks very much. There you go, Kathy.
Thank you, David, so much. Clearly, this is near and dear to all those involved in regulating data, not just in Asia Pacific, but we all are dealing with it day in, day out. So I think it definitely resonates across all the oceans and big bodies of water. We did get a
Absolutely.
couple questions, and I'd love to be able to pitch a few to you.
Okay.
Uh, First question, do you use some magic formula to determine how much effort it will take to pull together a picture of data?
Sure, sure. So there's always a formula, and I guess there's different variables in the formula, and it includes things like the number of critical data elements that you're looking at, the number of words in the requirement document itself, the percentage availability of subject matter experts, also a level of expertise in the data that we're actually trying to understand, and also a level of expertise in the data modeler. So you sort of mash them all together because experience in this modeling only really happens by doing it over and over again and practice and reviews. But you take all those variables, you throw them together, and you can come up with a number. And that's all I'm going to tell you about my magic formula.
Thank you. By the way, you reminded me, I did love your persona acting of all the roles in the organization from the C-level. That was fantastic. Another question for you. How hard is it to inject data modeling practices into projects that are in flight?
Yeah, good question. It's actually not that hard. It's only the desire to make sure that you know what you're doing and that you know as much as you can about the data and how it's being handled in the project. These data modeling practices are done to document system design and define implementation specification. Like I said before, logical data modeling, physical data modeling, they're all about modeling data, only in different levels of abstraction. So you can inject it pretty much any time into the project.
Excellent.
I
Uh,
yeah.
and this one I love. I'm curious to hear your answer as a valued partner of Erwin. If there was one other feature about Erwin DM you could tell us about, what would that be?
Ooh, yes, I tried to show you as many as I could in the short period of time, but this one would be about the ability to save templates for the different combinations of things that you can select when you're practicing your data modeling craft. Like there's a template I use when I'm only looking at a particular type of object. Like maybe I'm trying to assess how well I've documented the attributes in the model. So I save a configuration that I want to check, let's say their data type, um, their definition, are they part of a key, stuff like that. And so I can select all these things and then run a report to check it out, but I can save that away. And so I end up probably with tens and tens of different templates that I use for the different features in the tool. Yep.
Fantastic. So more questions that we receive, I hope you don't mind, and I think you've already agreed to, but we'll just let everyone else know that you'll follow up with folks after the event, and you can have a dialogue direct with them. But for now, if you wouldn't mind going forward one slide, we'll give a little bit of a promo to what's coming up next. So we want to make sure if we're in the data modeling track, folks be sure to keep time available for Erwin DM Connect for your Erwin DI suite, and then Erwin DM Power User Tips and Tricks, which it will be Vani Mishra in product management, which will also be fantastic in terms of making sure you know all the great features that come along with releases, especially if you're lagging a release or so back. For now, I would like to thank you, David, for taking time and energy to put this together and share your regulation story with us. I really do appreciate it. And I just also want to make sure that folks realize that you can go to the solution booths, whether it be for the solution you currently have or others that you want to learn more about. And then we also have two other tracks. So make sure the sessions that you do not attend at time of launch, they will be available on demand. So you can always go back and refer colleagues as well if they sit outside the cube wall and work in other areas of the business. We probably have a session that might be of interest to them as well. And then we have the networking lounge. So we, by all means, want to make sure that all of our Erwin customers are having an opportunity to not only meet with Erwin personnel, but also each other, right? So that's how we grow and we learn about how to exploit these solutions. Besides that, we have one more booth that I wanted to give a little shout out to, which would be the IT Central Station booth. They are a fantastic organization, which helps all of you that are assessing technologies to go out there and compare and look at customer reviews. And of course, we would love it if you'd be willing to fill out reviews for us. So if you are a current customer, please do be sure to stop by that IT Central Station booth and check it out. But David, thank you so much for the time you took with this presentation. I think it was very valued.
Great. My pleasure. It's great seeing you, Kathy. All the best to everyone out there.
Thank you, David. Okay, this concludes today's event. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.